17 men, 13 years. In the heart of Milwaukee, the ground seemed to swallow them whole. One by one, they walked away from bars, from bus stops, from the simple routines of their lives, and they never arrived home. For over a decade, the pattern remained invisible, hidden behind a facade of normalcy that defied every instinct of suspicion. How does a predator operate for 13 years without triggering a single alarm? How do 17 lives vanish while the world looks the other way? This is not just a story of a sequence of events. It is a study of a shadow that lived in plain sight, walking the same streets and breathing the same air as his neighbors. We are here to dismantle the silence that shielded him. We are here to examine the mechanics of a predator who turned the mundane into a hunting ground. By the end of this account, you will understand how one of history's most disturbing figures maintained his lethal rhythm. This is Final Statement. We begin by looking at the cracks in the foundation, where the first signs of a growing darkness were ignored, setting the stage for a cycle of violence that would claim 17 futures. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 inches Milwaukee. To the casual observer, his early years were entirely unremarkable. He attended school, played in the neighborhood, and existed within the standard frame of a suburban life. Yet, beneath this surface, a distinct shift began to manifest. As he entered adolescence, he withdrew from social circles. The world of other people ceased to interest him. Instead, he turned his focus toward the forest floor and the roadside. He began collecting the remains of animals that had perished in the wild. He did not simply gather them, he brought them home to study the decay. He spent hours in the basement, dissecting tissues and observing the physical realities of death. This was not a passing curiosity. It was a calculated, repetitive ritual. He kept bones in jars and examined the structure of muscle and skin with a detached, singular intensity. His parents remained largely unaware of the extent of these activities, assuming it was a phase of youthful, morbid curiosity. They could not see that he was learning the mechanics of anatomy. With every specimen he stripped and cleaned, the boundary between the living and the non-living began to blur. He was no longer just observing nature. He was preparing for something else entirely. By 1978, the family structure had dissolved. His parents separated, leaving 18-year-old Dahmer alone in the house. The isolation he had cultivated for years was now absolute. 3 weeks after his high school graduation, he encountered a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. He invited the man inside. When Hicks attempted to leave, the impulse shifted into a singular, violent motion. Dahmer struck him with a barbell, ending the interaction instantly. The house was quiet, but the reality of what he had done demanded a solution. He moved the body, buried the remains, and later returned to ensure the evidence was eradicated. He dissolved the tissues in acid and pulverized the bones until nothing recognizable remained. This was not a moment of panic. It was a methodical exercise in erasure. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The act of killing had ceased to be a theoretical curiosity and had become a tangible, repeatable event. He had successfully hidden a life in the dark, and in that silence, a predator was fully formed. He had tasted the control that comes with absolute termination, and he was ready to wait for the next opportunity to exert it again. For the next 9 years, the public record went silent. Dahmer sought to anchor himself in the military, joining the army in a desperate attempt to impose structure on his life. It failed. His days became defined by the constant presence of alcohol. He drank with a relentless, numbing frequency that eventually forced his discharge in 1981. He drifted back to Milwaukee, a man displaced by his own inability to function within ordinary society. He took up residence in his grandmother's home. To the neighborhood, he was merely a quiet, unremarkable presence, someone who kept to himself and caused no trouble. He spent his time in the lower levels of the house, maintaining a facade of domesticity while his internal reality grew increasingly turbulent. He moved through the streets, observing, calculating, and waiting. The alcohol served as a temporary barrier against the impulses that had taken root years prior. He was a predator in stasis, carefully selecting the environment for his next move. Every day spent in that quiet house was a lesson in patience. He was learning how to blend into the background, how to mirror the behavior of others, and how to stay invisible until the moment he decided the silence had lasted long enough. By 1987, the stagnation broke. The internal pressure finally outweighed the caution of his previous years. He visited a local bar, identified Stephen Tuomi as his next target, and brought him back to the quiet, unassuming house. The act was no longer a frantic reaction, but a deliberate sequence of events. He killed Tuomi in the basement. This space, once used for mundane household storage, became the site of a systematic dismemberment. He worked with a cold efficiency, processing the remains while the rest of the house remained undisturbed. The basement provided the privacy he required to experiment with his methods, turning human life into physical artifacts. He kept the process contained, ensuring no noise or evidence reached the floors above. This was the turning point. He moved from a singular, isolated act to a recurring pattern of behavior. Each step of the process, the selection at the bar, the transport, the violence, and the final disposal became a practiced ritual. He stopped viewing his actions as exceptions to his life and started seeing them as the primary focus of his existence. The basement was no longer just a room. It was the foundation of a new, lethal routine that would define the coming years. With the routine established, he ventured back into the public eye. He began frequenting shopping malls and bars, scanning the crowds for men who appeared isolated or in need of quick cash. He discarded the erratic behavior of his youth, replacing it with a carefully curated persona. He was soft-spoken. He was polite. He was, to any casual observer, entirely non-threatening. He understood that people do not look closely at those who seem harmless. When he approached a potential target, he did not project dominance. He projected a need for company, offering money to secure their trust. It was a simple, effective transaction that exploited the vulnerability of his targets and the apathy of the public. Once inside his apartment, the facade remained intact long enough to secure the door. He offered drinks, kept his tone measured, and maintained the appearance of a man hosting a guest. This dual existence became his greatest weapon. By mirroring the behavior of those around him, he moved through society like a shadow, invisible to those who might have noticed the cracks. He was not just killing, he was performing, turning his social interactions into a trap that functioned with cold, clockwork precision. Once the door clicked shut, the performance ended. He wasted no time. The drinks were laced with sedatives, ensuring his guests would not resist as he moved them to the bedroom. There, he strangled them, ending their lives with practiced, mechanical indifference. This was only the beginning of his preservation process. He kept human skulls in the refrigerator, nestled between everyday groceries. He saved body parts as if they were trophies of a hunt. He went further, consuming human flesh. A ritual, he claimed, helped him keep them a part of him. He built a macabre altar inside his closet, a shrine to his own depravity. He told investigators later that he found the lifestyle thrilling and had no desire to stop. He treated his victims as objects, rearranging them, observing them, and finally destroying them to satisfy an internal compulsion. He existed in a world where human life had no value beyond his immediate, twisted needs. He had turned his living space into a museum of horrors, where every item served as a reminder of a life he had extinguished. He remained calm, methodical, and completely devoid of empathy, living out his dark fantasies in plain sight behind a locked door. By 1988, his cycle of violence had become a constant, yet he remained invisible to the law. That year, he was arrested for the assault of a 13-year-old boy. The evidence was clear, the act was heinous, and the threat he posed to the community was undeniable. Yet, the justice system faltered. Instead of incarceration, he was granted probation. He walked out of the courtroom while his victim was left to deal with the trauma of the encounter. This decision was a catastrophic failure of oversight. It signaled to him that he could operate with near-total impunity. He returned to his apartment, the probation serving only as a temporary administrative hurdle, not a deterrent. The authorities had a chance to stop him, to identify the pattern before it spiraled further, but they chose to look away. His freedom was restored, and with it, his appetite for violence grew. He emerged from the legal proceedings emboldened, knowing the system would not intervene. He stepped back into the shadows of the city, ready to resume his hunt. While the authorities remained unaware of the monster they had left to roam free, the path ahead was clear, and the consequences would be catastrophic. May 1991. The apartment door opened. Konorak's synthesophone stumbled out onto the street. He was naked. He was bleeding. He could barely stand. 3 women witnessed his condition and immediately dialed 911. They watched from a distance, desperate for help to arrive. When the police pulled up, the boy was shivering, unable to articulate his terror. Dahmer stepped out to meet the officers. He was calm. He was composed. He told them the boy was his adult boyfriend and that they had simply been arguing. The officers looked at the boy, then at the man. The women pleaded with the police to look closer, to see the reality of the situation, but they were told to go home and mind their own business. The officers did not check for identification. They did not investigate the claims. They grabbed the boy by the arm and led him back inside. The door shut. The police walked away. The women stayed behind, watching the silence return to the street. Konorak was trapped again. His fate was sealed by the very people sworn to protect him. That night, the apartment became his tomb. The failure was total, absolute, and lethal. With the police gone and the door locked, the last barrier of restraint vanished. By the summer of 1991, the cycle entered a frantic, lethal rhythm. No longer waiting months between hunts, he began to kill every single week. The apartment in Milwaukee transformed into a factory of death. He scoured the city, seeking out vulnerable targets at bars and malls with a cold, mechanical efficiency. Each victim was lured, drugged, and silenced within hours of arrival. He no longer worried about witnesses or patrols. He operated in a state of absolute, unchecked arrogance. Inside the apartment, the space grew cramped with the remnants of his work. Skulls were stacked in corners. Body parts filled the refrigerator. He moved through the rooms with a terrifying, hollow purpose, consuming flesh to sustain his delusion. He was a man possessed by his own monstrous routine, spiraling deeper into a void where human life held no value. The city outside continued its daily life, entirely unaware that a predator was operating with such relentless frequency just behind their walls. Every 7 days, another light went out. Every 7 days, the collection of remains grew. He was working at a pace that demanded discovery, yet the shadows remained undisturbed. The summer heat pressed down on the building, trapping the scent of rot inside, while he prepared for the next hunt. The 22nd of July, 1991, the atmosphere inside the apartment shifted. Tracy Edwards realized he was not leaving through the front door. He saw the shift in the gaze across from him and moved. A desperate scramble. A blunt force strike. Edwards surged toward the exit. He hit the hallway, stumbled into the cool night air, and did not look back. One hand was still locked in a steel cuff, the metal clattering against his wrist with every stride. He ran until his breath burned his lungs. He reached the street corner, frantic, scanning the dark road for any sign of life. A pair of headlights cut through the gloom. Edwards lunged into the center of the lane, waving his unencumbered arm, the dangling cuffs catching the street lamp light. The cruiser slowed. He reached the window, his chest heaving, pointing back toward the building. He could not find the words, so he held up his wrists. The officers saw the metal. They saw the terror. They stepped out of the vehicle and moved toward the apartment building. The 13-year wall of silence finally began to crack. The game of avoidance was over. The hunt had reached its absolute end. The officers climbed the stairs to 213, their hands resting on their sidearms. They knocked, then pushed the door open. The air inside was thick, heavy with a sharp chemical stench that clung to the back of the throat. Dahmer stood in the center of the room, motionless, watching them enter. He offered no protest. He stepped aside as they moved into the kitchen. One officer pulled the refrigerator door open. He did not look away. He saw the hearts. He saw the organs. He stepped back, hand over his mouth. Another officer moved to the closet. He reached for a pile of boxes, pulling them down to reveal a collection of human skulls. They were lined up like trophies. On the table, the officers found a stack of Polaroids. They flipped through the photos, each image revealing a new, grotesque stage of the crimes. Severed heads, dismembered limbs. There was no room left for doubt. The evidence was not hidden, it was displayed. The officers looked at each other, the weight of the discovery settling in the room. They had spent years patrolling these streets, unaware of the horror that had been breathing behind this single door. The predator stood silent as they moved to secure the scene. 13 years of secrets were laid bare in the light of the hallway lamp. The investigation transitioned from the basement to the courtroom. By 1992, the trial began, pulling the details of the past decade into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Dahmer took the stand. He spoke with a steady, eerie precision, detailing the mechanics of his crimes. He described the process of drugging, the act of strangulation, and the subsequent dismemberment as if he were recounting a mundane daily chore. He showed no sign of remorse. His defense team argued he suffered from a mental break, claiming he could not comprehend the weight of his actions. They pushed for a verdict of insanity. The prosecution held up the evidence of his calculated routine: the selection of bars, the systematic lure, the preservation of remains. They argued that these were not the actions of a man out of touch with reality, but of a predator who understood exactly what he was doing. The jury listened to the testimony for days. They weighed the chilling confession against the clinical planning. When the foreman stood to deliver the final word, the room went silent. The jury rejected the insanity plea. They found him legally sane. He was held fully responsible for the 17 lives he had taken. The gavel fell, ending the attempt to retreat into a mental void. He was sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms. The law had caught up to the 13-year cycle. The prison walls offered no sanctuary from the past. By November 1994, Dahmer had been transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution. He was assigned to work in the prison gymnasium. On a quiet morning, he walked toward the maintenance area, accompanied by 2 other inmates. Christopher Scarver followed them. He carried a metal bar. Scarver stepped into the room and closed the distance between them. He did not hesitate. He struck Dahmer across the head with the bar. The impact echoed off the concrete walls. Dahmer fell to the floor. He did not fight back. He did not put up his hands to defend his face. He accepted the blows. Scarver continued the assault until the movement stopped. The guards found them moments later. Dahmer was still breathing, but his skull was shattered. They moved him to the hospital, but the damage was irreversible. He died hours later. His life ended by the same brutality he had inflicted upon others. There was no grand final statement, no plea for mercy, just a silent, violent end to a 13-year cycle of destruction. The predator who had spent his life controlling the fate of his victims had his own fate decided in a locked, concrete room. The prison remained silent as the news spread. The man who had terrorized a city was gone. The death of the perpetrator did not erase the failure of the Milwaukee police. The Synthesom phone incident remained a dark stain on the department, forcing a reckoning that led to disciplinary actions and a long-overdue review of how vulnerable communities were treated by those sworn to protect them. Yet, the systemic failures were only half the story. The true tragedy lay in the 17 lives that were cut short, lives that held potential, dreams, and connections that were stolen in the dark. We remember them now not as statistics or names in a case file, but as individuals whose existence mattered. Their absence left voids that never truly closed. History often focuses on the monster, but the reality of human darkness is not found in the perpetrator's actions alone. It is found in the silence that follows, and the indifference that allows such horror to persist. Some stories sound like fiction, until the weight of the truth forces you to acknowledge that the darkness is real. This has been Final Statement. Subscribe to ensure these victims are never forgotten. We hold their memory as a barrier against the dark, refusing to let the shadows have the final word.